As Melissa said, I went there to begin with a group of first graders and followed them as their class teacher through 8th grade, and then turned around and went back to first grade and did it again, and had a little break and picked up a class in 4th grade. And the last decade or roughly, I've been working with middle school students, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, a little bit in 9th and 10th grade into the high school. And I've been doing it so much, I start to wonder if I could ever get back down to first grade and not ruin the little children. But it's a different world up there with middle school children, but I've gotten to really like it quite a lot. And what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about that stage of development, not all of adolescence, but this real critical stage that is often referred to these days as middle school, grade 6, 7, 8, and transition toward high school. And a little bit about what that means in terms of what a Waldorf school, how a Waldorf school tries to address the changes in that age, and a little bit about our journey in doing that as well. We're now a K through 12 school with 3 kindergartens, and we go through high school. I think what's really interesting about this age is it's a study in contrasts in many ways. We, in our curriculum, have a story material that's a core to each grade. And among first graders, it's the fairy tale. This is a picture of once upon a time, and how does it end? Happily ever after. Right, so it's kind of bracketed by this and lifts one out of just the usual day-to-day world, and it's a real wonderful, rich world of the imagination there. And it reflects that dreamy state, that dreamy stage that the child is at in the first grade, and the story material around which so much of the curriculum revolves continues and evolves with the children, so that the subjects that are taught, the themes that are invoked by, particularly visibly through the story material, are a reflection and a support to that particular stage of consciousness. So if we were to jump to the 3rd grade, these are children 8, 9 years old who are beginning to look at the world around them a little bit differently. Begin to step back a bit from it and size things up and size the adults up. And if you've been through that stage, you may have a little sense of it. I once had a late 2nd grade, in the later part of 2nd grade, a parent who came to me as I was trying to get ready for class that morning, and she said, every night before she falls to sleep when she's in bed, my daughter says, what if there's nothing? And this is, a 2nd grader, a kind of existential moment. Her middle name is Sart. But it's not actually that common. Often it's not articulated. It passes through fairly unnoticed. For Hermann Hesse, it was a moment when he realized that this wonderful picture book, this childhood storybook that he'd gone back to time after time, had a page number. And it was a kind of a sense of ejection out of that dreamy world and that deep connection with the adults around them. If you recall or are in the midst of this period with a newborn and a very young child, how completely they're woven into your lives. And this is a step away from that. And it's kind of a preview of 6th grade, where the same thing happens, but a little more dramatically. And drama sometimes is the key word. In the 6th grade, well, actually, let me step back to the 5th grade. There's this middle period between that 9-year change in 3rd grade, roughly 8, 9, and the beginning of puberty, kind of Tom Sawyer time, a time of balance. And this is a time when they hear stories of ancient cultures, but particularly a theme that resonates with that particular stage of development is the story of the Greek people. And if you can watch any of the students who are working on the pentathlon, any of the Greek exercises, the balance that you see if you've looked at Greek sculpture, particularly something like the discus thrower, there's a sense of balance there between these two points of possible turmoil in their lives. And so that those pictures in the story materials serve as a real reflection of who they are and where they're moving at that particular time. The Greeks, really history begins in 5th grade, and the Greeks took something like the very practical geometry of Egypt and Mesopotamia, which was used to build buildings, and began to lift it from the material world, and then began to live with geometry as an abstraction, that they could visualize the ideal circle and begin to understand its characteristics. And they look at the triangle, something that simple, and realize that equilateral triangle was so symmetrical. It was to them like a god. And then the isosceles triangle with 2 equal legs was like an angel. And then the scalene triangle, you know what scalene means? It's limping. This is the human being on the earth. And so these pictures come straight out of history and the experience of the Greek people. The Greeks, among many other things, were scientists. They began to really think about things in a somewhat abstract, intellectual way. And when we move from 5th grade into 6th grade, we move from this kind of pure science of the Greeks to the Romans. And the Romans were engineers. They took a lot of the knowledge. Their tutors were mostly Greek scholars, and they took a lot of that knowledge and brought it down onto the earth, built the Roman road, which is still there, aqueducts, baths, heated baths, so that you could go from one bath to another with different temperatures. And their engineering is all around the Mediterranean world. And it's a little bit of a picture of a kind of change that goes on at puberty. And an image that is particularly valuable in understanding their age is one of the Roman gods, one that they were very proud they hadn't taken from the Greeks. And this is the god Janus or Janus. And this is where we get the word January from. And this was a 2-headed god. His faces looked in 2 directions. And his temple was always closed during peacetime. It was opened at the beginning of war and closed at the end of a war. He was the god of transitions, of doorways, of moving from one phase to another. And it's particularly telling image for the child of this age, because at one moment, and I'm saying once they're moved into late 6th grade and on into this middle school age, one moment they will be acting quite quote-unquote adult, and another moment go looking for that teddy bear or that doll that they had years ago. There's a real flipping back and forth that goes on, sometimes hidden, and because one doesn't want to let everything be known. And it's a time of real self-consciousness, and rightly so in many ways. One teacher that I used to know would refer to this time as each child, male or female, being pregnant, and pregnant in the sense of giving birth to an independent soul life, that their lives and their inner lives were so much woven in with the adults around them, their parent, their teacher, and now, even more than what I described in the 9-year change, there's this sense of being pulled back and away from it all, looking at the world out there. Another way of describing it, it's as though there was this house where there was a hearth and there was warmth in it, and you could enter out and enter in and come out, and now the doors were locked and you can only look at it through one window after another. You're not quite sure that the world is what you thought it was before. And they're still not at a point where they can articulate it and really describe to you what it's like. But it's a time of great contrast, not just looking back and forward, but of emotional ups and downs. How many really would like to go back and relive that time? Nah, usually don't get too many hands. It's a challenge to grow up at that age, and I think it becomes in many ways more and more of a challenge as the pace of life and the stimulation and the things that the young people are able to be exposed to is accelerated to such a tremendous extent. A lot of choices have to be made that never had to be made at that age before. A lot of judgments have to suddenly come up that weren't so necessary to be, it wasn't so necessary that you would be on your own with those. You still had a bit of a surrounding, caring world that is a little more fragmented these days, and the outer world moves right into our house in ways that it didn't always before. I was telling someone today, the exposure to media is very interesting. Someone sent me a picture of one of these bouncy baby chairs with a computer screen attached to it. It's an interesting image. At this time, while I mentioned a kind of birth or pregnancy, giving birth to an independent soul life, that is an experience. In order to nurture that and to care for that, you have to push the other world about and out and away. So you have this experience of that in ways that you may never have experienced with your child before that. And it's different with every child, and we can talk in generalities, but we see one way or another that the young person in puberty goes through that. And what's happened on another level in terms of conception and birth is that, of course, they're able to physically reproduce, and there was a time when that was the initiation into adulthood, and that's when you were married, in the Middle Ages and other indigenous cultures, and you were an adult then, and we're sort of fixed. Today, people getting married in their 30s, right, and having children, 20 years later, often, a very big shift. And most of us, knowing our 12-year-olds, really would not wish parenthood on them for quite a long time. But there's actually more than just the sexual awakening. There is a new ability to conceive on another level, and that's to conceive an independent thought. And we even use that word. What is the concept, the conception? How do we conceive of this idea? And this is the almost an explosion of a new ability to think in very interesting ways. But to step back a little bit, in Waldorf education, we think of child development from one point of view in terms of three fairly distinct stages. That birth to 7, in which the will on many levels is developed, even on an organic level where you see the tremendous amount of growth. It's a kind of will deed that the human being can grow at that rate. And then just the ability to stand upright and begin to speak. These are great, tremendous achievements of will that we take for granted years later. In this period from 7 to 14, the feeling life is being developed in a new way. And at this time, at around 14, the thinking begins to appear in a new form. And this ability to conceive and to think is still very much attached to the feeling life, often the desire life. So you can see a tremendous amount of cleverness come out at this time. It's not yet, it's cleverness, not quite wisdom. At this point, I can remember distinctly being able to out-argue my father, much to his frustration. But I don't know that I had the better argument than he had. But pardon?
Stamina.
Yeah, stamina, and just kind of being a bit full of yourself and thinking that you've got this new ability to really think through things. And it's a kind of cleverness. And in our curriculum, we would understand that this would be a natural awakening and appearance of a new faculty that we want to take and work with and bring towards something that is more constructive, more objective, moves from just cleverness to wisdom. And I can tell you talk a little bit about one way we might do this in the curriculum. One way is through geometry. You might think, what has geometry got to do with the inner life of the growing human being? Well, it has a tremendous amount to do with that. They've been doing freehand form drawing and geometric drawing since first grade. Ribbon forms and sometimes actual geometric forms. I actually can, before I show you the sixth grade, just begin to look at, these are just freehand drawings done in a fifth grader, looking at different simple forms, sometimes braided, overlapping forms, and characteristics of simple forms. Isosceles triangles and scaling, etc. And in sixth grade, they take up a compass and a straight edge. And they do standard Euclidean constructions, but we also work to bring an artistic element to it. If you have to, maybe you haven't sat down with a compass and straight edge and pencil in a while, but if you do, you find if you want a really good drawing to come about, you've got to be careful. You've got to be precise. You can't be sloppy about it because the end result just isn't going to be something you like. So, in addition to just studying basic patterns and geometric forms, I had one book, it might be we begin to look at more interesting forms that I think I've got a different book for. Ones I wanted to show you. Yeah, things like this in the sixth grade, which is the result of drawing a circle and not letting the radius deviate at all and stepping off that radius on the circumference and then bisecting that and creating points of intersection, then bisecting it again, and then you can connect it in many different ways. There are lots of different possibilities. But you can see there's a real need for precision, for care, for that new critical faculty that's begun to become alive in them. And the forms are really beautiful in their own right, without any color. But then to bring the color into it, and the color should always bring out a quality or a characteristic of the underlying geometric form. So this one was divided probably into 48 sections. I had one student who went home and did a large format drawing of this with a 96th division of the circle, which is, you've got to be really careful about. So these would be drawings that could be done in sixth grade. Some of them have been done in seventh. And you see it's an experience of that newfound critical sense, and still a sense for beauty and the reverence for form. Let's see what else I have here. The curriculum is always, our curriculum is always working in and connecting to earlier stages and ones to come later on. So in first grade, they would have had lessons commonly on the quality of numbers. Where do we find one in the world? Where do we find two? In two, you have symmetry and you have contrast, hot and cold, light and dark. In three, you have those extremes and the medium, the middle. Four has an earthly quality to it, the four legs of your chair or your desk, and so on. You can cut an apple across. Right? Have you ever done that? Cut it not down, but across. And what do you see? You see a five-pointed star. It's important that it's five-pointed star. And then in fifth grade, you study monocotyledons and dicotyledons and see number is there in those seed leaves, and it's also in the resultant fruit that comes about. And so with geometry and with numbers, we're working to bring a connection between the individual, the human being, the child, and the world around him or her. There are those who think mathematics was invented simply to torture young people, but that's not our approach to it. We have a sense that number is something that is there out in the world. Otherwise, formulas in chemistry and physics wouldn't exist, wouldn't really reflect that order. So in eighth grade, when we're doing geometry, we we go back, I like to ask them, what story did their teacher tell them that really gave a picture of addition? And often it's a plump fellow with a full sack of things that he's been accumulating, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And I have students from different Waldorf schools, and for one it was Papa Plus, another it was Prince Positive or something like this, and the characters all sort of merge together into the same general characteristic. And then out of that we work out a little formula and bipolar coordinates and begin to get conic sections, a picture of the ellipse, which you can see is a little bit of the form of that addition character, which I have them draw up in the corner as well. And then there's another little formula that we use with these coordinates that involves subtraction, and we get the hyperbola. And mistress minus was quite thin and tall and was always losing things out of her sack. And here we have her in this, or him, or whoever it was, in this particular conic section. And then the lemniscate with multiplication here, crossing in the middle. I won't go into all the stories, there's only so much time. And then division, where the forms actually separate into more than one section. And these are the circles of Apollonius. So as they're studying the locus, what a locus is in geometry, we'll work with that. And this is another nice drawing. A spiral that is built out of right triangles. In the middle school, we still keep in mind certain, or never forget, certain basic tenets in Waldorf education. And one is that while the intellect is a very important part of the human being to be developed and schooled as any other school would, we also feel that just a developed intellect is impoverished without a rich imagination. And we can think of imagination as the stuff of artists and dreamers, but we really also feel that it is very practical. To be able to visualize a solution to a problem that hasn't been handed to you is a pretty important skill. To be able to see the unseen, to be able to find a way forward that isn't handed to you, which is one reason we have concerns about all the vast input of media that really gives pre-made, commercially made, often images that flood the inner life of the child. When do they have time to really reflect and begin out of themselves to build an imagination? But even with something like geometry, you can see or get an experience of how the imaginative faculty would work. So, if you'll bear with me, just imagine that this room were a bare cube, which means all lines are equal in size, all angles are the same. Real perfect cube. It's made out of squares. How many squares? 6. And in the center of each one, you screw a little eyelet. In the ceiling, in the floor, in the 4 walls. And you have a red ribbon, bright red ribbon, and you tie it to one of these eyelets. And then you bring it up through the eyelet, the ceiling, over to the eyelet in the middle of the other wall, down to the one in the middle of the floor, and over to the right. What do you have? You have a red square, right? It's tilted at 45 degrees from the other one. Well, there's an eyelet behind you, and you can attach that ribbon there and pull it through this one, that one, that one, and that one, and you have another square. And then you can continue until all the eyelets are joined, and you have a form that fits into the square perfectly by joining all the midpoints of all its walls. These are 2 forms that Plato particularly liked because they gained his name. They're called Platonic solids. And the cube inside of it is perfectly adapted by joining those midpoints to a form called the octahedron. And the octahedron if you were to, it has triangular sides. It's a little hard for me to show you without, sometimes I bring models, but I wasn't able to bring them on the plane. But if you connect those midpoints of the octahedron within itself, then you get another cube. And within that cube, another octahedron, and it goes on forever. And these are called duals. They have a special relationship. And in 8th grade, we work with platonic solids with the three-dimensional geometry. And these forms can be built up from nets, what we would call a net. If I can, I don't have a picture of a net. But if you imagine you take a cube and you fold it out flat, imagine a cross. That's one way you can do it, which is 4 long with 2 squares on either side. Fold it up, you get the cube. And so we make paper models. We also work with something called zone tools, which were designed by some mathematicians, one of whom was our high school math teacher, and build these forms and hang them in the room. But within this cube, you can find its dual, which is the octahedron, this form here. It's kind of an orthographic picture of it. The simplest one, that's a platonic solid, is the tetrahedron. Can you imagine what happens if you join the midpoints of each of these sides? There are 4 triangles. See, it does take a little imagination, right? It's a little hard because I'm only showing you a 2-dimensional picture. But if you were to join them all, you would get the same form, inverted, right? This is its own dual. And then we move on to the dodecahedron, which is here, 12-sided form made out of pentagons, and build the models in a couple of different ways. They work in clay with these as well. And then try to figure out what the dual is to this, because this is a 12-sided figure. And whatever it is going to have 12 vertices, and it's the icosahedron, which is a 20-sided form with triangular sides. Some people see the symbol for Chrysler in here, mostly the boys in the class, but no, that's true. So I teach a lot of geometry, so I wax on about it. But you can see a picture of how we work to connect threads in the curriculum, connect the experience to the world around them, and connect it to themselves as well, so that they're not simply going through exercises of some abstraction that they don't feel they have any meaningful relationship to. That is certainly true in the earliest grades and has to metamorphose in a new way on into the middle school. I mentioned that one of the themes around which the curriculum revolves in the 6th grade is the study of Rome, but very closely connected to that are the Middle Ages, so medieval history is also a part of that. And then in 7th grade, when they've gone through a bit of this change and they've moved into puberty and start to have this dim sense of their future, who are they, what are they moving toward? They study the Renaissance, the Italian artistic Renaissance, the explorers who, for all their good and bad qualities, left a familiar place and left a shore without quite knowing what they were going to encounter. And maybe they weren't so great when they got there. But this is an experience that the 7th grader and these young people have of moving out from the familiar into a world beyond just the safe circle of their family, which they have mixed feelings about sometimes at moments at this point. The religious changes in Europe, where Martin Luther begins to challenge accepted dogma. These changes in science with Copernicus and Kepler and Tycho Brahe and Galileo. And all of these new changes, ways of looking at the world that were completely different from the very rigid traditions that were there throughout the Middle Ages. Very much a picture of the 7th grader and their changes. And in 8th grade, we move to the age of revolution. All rebellion, and particularly the English Civil War, which was a a move against absolute monarchy when it was starting to strengthen at that time, and then, of course, Louis and the Louis in France and the French Revolution. And perhaps one of the most important revolutions, really, I think, as in terms of implications for our daily life, is really the Industrial Revolution, where if you were to look at life 300 to 400 years ago, it would be almost unrecognizable. A time when the children stayed with the family, they worked on the farm, or they worked at the craft that the family had been doing. And at a certain point in the late 18th century in England, the farms and the small towns began to empty out, and people clustered around factories. Urban life really accelerated, crowded conditions, all sorts of abuses, and a really different relationship to the world around you that, to one extent or another, is our inheritance these days. We've gone through the early steam evolution, and now we're in a computer period. I was recently looking at something in the New York Times about these new carbon substances that are 1 atom thick, that are supposed to be strong, flexible, and have all sorts of possibilities. Graphene, that's it, yeah. I couldn't quite get the name.
Sometimes stronger than steel.
Yeah.
Also conducts heat and electricity.
You got it. It's an amazing thing, and it's a natural progression from the burst of science and the Enlightenment and all its application to technology, which was the first steam technology. But it really helps for the young person, really for all of us, to begin to have a sense of where the things that simply are here now came from. So as we look at these revolutions, we'll take a look at, here's a spinning jenny. There was a war that was going on really between spinners and weavers, and in England in the early Industrial Revolution, new technology came along, and one outstripped the other, and then the other one had to accommodate, and both of them created a need for much more cotton, which increased the number of slaves being employed in this country. So the social implications all over were really something. James Watt created a reciprocating steam engine. Can't see it very well from there, but we'll work to give them a sense of the cleverness of this. Before this, you had to heat a chamber, heat the water, the steam would push a piston, and it would move a rocker arm that would actually, the initial function was to draw water out of the coal mines in England, and that whole steam chamber then had to be cooled down, and then the water boiled again. It was a very slow, laborious mechanical process. But he created a system where steam was continually channeled to two sides of this piston, and you get a kind of reciprocating action that increased the speed, the efficiency tremendously. So now we have bulbs with wattage named after James Watt, because he had so much to do with increasing steam power and in his time. So beginning to really penetrate these kinds of changes is important. I could show you, I have a lot of books here if you're interested in looking. So over there are a few high school books on environmental science and I think chemistry and some others. Some of these books are scans and composites from different children. Some are books that are current there in classes. The history that starts back in ancient times with India and Persia, Egypt, and Greece, and these other epochs that I mentioned to you, is a gesture from the distant past to the present, so that they're studying current events in the 8th grade and come right up into the 21st century. The difficult thing is that the Waldorf schools were created 90-some years ago. There was a lot less history to teach then, so we've had to find room for much more. Geography has a completely opposite gesture, where it starts close in and moves out spatially. So then 4th grade, you might even have the students put little things on their desk and stand on the chair and create a map, and then map the school and learn about their local area and why certain things are named what they are, and then move on to North American geography, and by the end of 8th grade, a sense for the wider world in geography. So I have a few pages from Study of China in 8th grade that I just thought I'd show you. Practice a little bit of calligraphy. Yeah. I have to be careful with these because if I damage them, I'm in big trouble. Confucius. These are biozones. Not much you can see from a distance. More.
It's interesting that they still continue the theme of making their own workbooks.
Yeah, that'll continue right through 12th grade, and often college professors are surprised, taken aback when they get a paper with illustrations, or just going into another school in, from junior high to high school, because we don't want to create a one-dimensional experience of all of this. Really, I had history as a young person, and very often wasn't that well taught. And when I actually came to look at it again as an adult, it was an eye-opener because it's fascinating. I know people who don't read any fiction or anything else; they will read just history because of the impact, the power, and the drama of it all. And why does that get lost on children? Why can't it build out of the simple stories of the fairy tales in the 1st grade and continue as biography through the older grades, and still have a narrative form, which is really the story of humanity on one level or another? I think I'd like to just read a little bit from a 7th grader's creative writing book. We do a block of creative writing lessons in the 7th grade that have 3 themes. One is wish, another wonder, and another surprise. And usually we'll start with wonder. Now, if you have a 1st grader or a kindergartner, 2nd grader, and you want them to experience wonder, it's not too hard. Take them out in the sand, in the dirt, go to the woods, whatever. Almost anything. I would have 1st graders coming to me with pebbles of granite, showing me the jewel that they had found in the dust. 7th graders are different. Not so easy. So how do you help a 7th grader experience wonder in the world? If you start telling them something is wonderful, you can be sure you've blown it already, and you can just kind of hang it up and go home, because that's an incitement to not experience wonder. But we have a really prevailing cynicism, almost like a mist through our society that you may or may not experience to various degrees, that we want to bring a little bit of almost a homeopathic counterbalance to. How do we help them at least get regain a little bit of an experience of that wonder of the world? And so one thing we will do in 7th grade in these lessons is not say anything about wonder, but have the first day of that block a bunch of things on the desk. A dried leaf, a green leaf, a fossil, a piece of wood, a feather, all sorts of common objects like that, and ask each student to take one at some point in the lesson and go off alone for 20 minutes and just look at it and just really begin to look at it. So what happens at first? It's a feather. Then you have to stay there for that 20 minutes and look, well, there's this rib and these what happens if I push this part of the feather back? And you begin to explore and see beneath the surface. Because most of the time, even young people, we walk through the world in a kind of with a kind of gray cast. We cast our concepts over it. No one thinks much about the door you go through, but if you actually looked at it, you would see this is something that someone created and put thought into and made. And even more so when it comes to nature, something with a real deep history. And so you really will be surprised how much you can begin to see wonder light up, excitement and interest light up in these students. And then we can go to wish. And that age, that wish is very susceptible. If you tell them, well, have a wish for the world, and they'll say, I want to be a really rich movie star so I can give all my money to the rest of the world. And you see it's really a not very well-concealed selfish wish. So we'll start with a wish for yourself. How can you be better in some way? A wish for someone in your social sphere, maybe someone in your family, someone in the classroom. And move out from there into the wider world. And I just wanted to read you one little paragraph that one student wrote some years ago. I wish to be a Renaissance woman. I wish to study art, literature, ancient civilizations, astronomy, politics, theology, ecology, and more. Since I was little, I have dreamed of brightening and inspiring people's lives through writing and teaching. I hope these can implement the fulfillment of my aching desire to improve my world, though it may be by influencing someone who influences someone else, and on and on. I have trust in the fulfillment this would grant, because whenever one sends ripples of goodwill out into the world, they bring so much joy, as if they lap the shore and return. Hopefully, by learning as much as I can throughout my life, I will be able to serve the world as much as possible in everything I do. So if you're careful, you move from a real, potentially selfish wish to another. She has another piece of writing here, someone who's had a hard time in life that her family knows, and she writes about wishes for him. And since this is a Waldorf school, I thought I'd read this one, which is on art. Whenever I feel soft, moist clay taking shape between my fingers, watch the hidden grace within a stone reveal itself as I rasp away the rough surface, or paint a scene that seems to emerge from the paper of its own accord, I feel as though a part of me pours through my fingertips and is embodied in a piece of art. When I express my ideas, opinions, observations, and dreams by writing or talking with people I respect and trust, I am reminded of how important this part of me is. I wish that children could all be given the chance to explore their creative side. I hope that I can help, maybe by becoming a teacher, because most children are deprived of opportunities to use more than a few markers and coloring books to experience art. I wish for them to be inspired to read, create, and explore, and share with people who respect and encourage their interests and aspirations. I hope that I will be able to contribute to a more nurturing environment for the children to discover their potential and innate artistic ability. So we should put this on a Waldorf School brochure and just use it, but we haven't.
Is she a Waldorf teacher now?
No, she's probably just getting to her mid-20s and not quite sure, just getting out of college and not quite sure what she's going to do, I think. But she will do something great. There's no question in my mind, knowing who she is. I guess I would take a little bit of time to just talk about the practical side of a middle school. Because, and I can perhaps talk a bit about it in terms of our own school, which actually, different from many Waldorf schools, didn't start as a kindergarten, but started as a first grade. And then second, and it grew very fast in Austin, Texas. There was a lot of interest quickly. So the second year there was a kindergarten, or maybe two, and a couple of other grades. And we experienced great increases in enrollment from 11 the first year to 60-some the second, 128 the third year. And it's just because of where we happen to be and what people wanted at that particular time in the early 80s and mid 80s. And we added a class one by one, and we went up through 6th. And some of the classes that had been inserted just started as a 4th grade in particular, graduated a small number of students. And then my class went through and we graduated a class of, may have been 12 students, I think, at the time. Maybe 18, not sure. And the teacher after me did as well. But it was quite clear that we had moved so fast into something that we were not ready for. In order to be ready to address kids or human beings of this age, it needs more than just the same thing we were doing in 1st and 2nd and 3rd and 4th. It needs a real shift, just as they have a tremendous shift. You have to be ready as an individual teaching them to stand in a new way, in a new kind of relationship to these students, but the school also has to do that as well. They need to begin to feel what they'll experience more in a high school, a bit more of expertise, a bit more sense of strength in the academic subjects, a challenge. If you have a class at this age that's not feeling challenged, sometimes they find a lot of other ways to challenge themselves. And our school did not have, there were some strong class teachers, but we were in the middle of Texas, and so many the training centers were on the coasts, and if you know anything about people who live on the coasts, they don't know the middle exists. This is just, it's a place to fly over. And it wasn't always so easy, especially if they're coming from the liberal Northeast to Texas, or the liberal California coast to Texas. So even it was a challenge with class teachers. We had quite a struggle with, particularly with teaching staff. They need a strong orchestra program or music program of some sort. We have them grapple with wood and woodworking and clay, artists that can really challenge them. Fiber arts that have gone beyond the knitting that they're doing in the first couple of grades, so that they're making their own shirt or pajamas in 8th grade on sewing machines. So you need equipment. You need just a certain amount of infrastructure. In our school these days, they choose a stringed instrument in 3rd grade, and then in 5th grade they have the opportunity to move either out of the orchestra and into a band instrument. So we have 2 major concerts for high school is different, but lower than high school, for the middle school and other grades. An combined orchestra band concert in the fall and another one in the spring, plus a choral, 2 choral groups. And in 6th grade we separate the boys and the girls in terms of chorus, so that the self-consciousness is not so much there, and the boys can really do stuff that the girls would, or won't do things that the girls would love and they would rather not touch. And their voices are so different. The boys' voices are changing at this time, and it creates another layer of self-consciousness. So we have those choral groups as well. And we have woodworking, and sports teams. In European Waldorf schools will not have that, but European schools don't have sports teams attached to their schools. It's an un-American thing. It's definitely an un-Texan thing to do, to not have sports associated with your school. I mean, we don't do a tackle football, and there's been plenty in the news about concussions and difficulties with all of that. And we do have other sports, and we will even in the high school create small. If there's a few people who want to do a swim team, we'll make arrangements with a trainer, and they'll compete as well. So there are a number of larger team sports: basketball, volleyball, flag football. They compete against leagues that are generally private schools of similar size. Parochial schools and other private schools in the area, and they generally do quite well. They start, the first thing they do is some track in 6th grade, second half of 6th grade, and then these other teams. on, and more in the high school than in the middle school. But you can see there's a fair amount of support activity and infrastructure that makes a middle school work and be challenging, engaging, and balanced in many different ways. So in our school, as I went through that first class, we did not have enough of that. And what we ended up doing actually was shrinking our school back from an 8th grade school to a 6th grade school, and decided to address those issues, to begin to recruit strong special subject teachers and look toward beginnings of an athletic program, and more care and work on networking for recruiting. And we targeted a class that was a 3rd grade. Teacher had taught in public high schools before, and we added a kindergarten, so we had this kind of pyramid effect. We had more students there that funneled up into the grades, and that class that we targeted from 3rd grade went on up to 6th and then 7th and 8th with much better support and infrastructure. And then that teacher forged ahead to create the high school, and did in a very Texas pioneer way, and it's been going about a dozen years now. And our school has about 380 students these days, more or less, in it. Some of our classes have 30, 32 students. But it was important that we knew what we were doing and not simply tumbling into the next grade and the next stage. So that's basically what I have to offer, and it's almost 8. We've got another half hour or so I can open it up to questions and see if I can answer them.
Do you see the same drama that exists, all shapes and sorts that exists in public schools? You know, anything from bullying to gangs, I don't know.
We haven't had to deal with gangs, but a lot of behavior that's in society is in our school. It isn't. We don't live in an ivory tower. So even if it's from these little things, and you see the girls will mature first in puberty, and you'll start to see they're so much more awake than the boys and know much more about social relationships, as all men know for the rest of their lives. But they will there still have a tendency to move into little alliances or cliques and these sorts of things. So they're not immune from those things at all. But our intent is to maintain a relationship, be aware of it, and be able to work with these sorts of things. So particularly when I was a class teacher and this kind of thing erupted among some of the girls, and they were kind of at each other a little bit, I called in one of our other teachers who's very good with social things, and was a female, and worked with them and took the boys out to do something else, and vice versa, depending upon what the issues are. So these kinds of things do come. The media is pretty pervasive. We have had issues in high school with drugs, drinking. Those things are not going to just not be there. I hate to tell you, but they're in the world to such an extent that that they'll come in. But what's important is that we are not treating the children like numbers or processing. It's not a child processing facility. It's a place where we're interested in building and working through relationships and coming to see how we can help, working with the parents. We've brought in counselors for one thing or another in the high school. But we haven't had to deal with gangs, I must say. It just hasn't been partly, they don't live in the same place. Probably like yourselves, you're coming from different places. You're not coming from a neighborhood. They're not, in that kind of relationship. Are there bullies? That will happen, but you don't let it go. You have to be aware of that and work with redeeming those relationships and working with transformation. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah. Yes?
You've kept your very inspiring discussion of what's offered in Waldorf education during these years with that very astute reflection that your own school went through of needing to scale back.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, as you open it up to questions, if you might offer at any point before you leave us this evening an assessment from your perspective and experience of what you see as areas for concentration here at our school, with what you've seen in the little time.
In these 2 days, yeah.
You know, you might want to think about this area, and you might need to think about that area.
Yeah, well, I don't think I'll go into too much detail, but I think what I've understood from conversations I've had is that the faculty is on a very healthy trajectory with summer trainings that are going on. I think a real commitment by the core faculty to really grapple with what is at the root of Waldorf education, what are the core values and practices, and that will make more of a difference than anything. And building upon that, I was once a school in Lexington in Massachusetts, where I used to live in that area, and they were ready to stop their growth because they were in a rented facility and they couldn't go any further, and they were debating should they try to work to increase enrollment and raise funds for another place. They decided to intensify a study that they were working on, and the study of the children that they had as well, and someone walked in with a $100,000 check within a couple of weeks to help them make that move. Everybody's dream, right? But those kinds of things, I mean, if you're really working at to understand what this is and to build not just an academic program, but a program that has an artistic richness to it, and then begin, I think, whenever you come closer to the reality of a middle school, which is a challenge when you have combined classes, but can be done, you have to begin to think about the kinds of things that we didn't think about when we moved into those, which was a really strong, stable, committed group of teachers in addition to the class teachers who will begin to bring that strength and expertise around the core experience of the class teacher. But I think building something internally that is compelling for those who come and encounter it is kind of a core experience, I would say. And then at some point, as we were thinking of, and this applied more to the high school than just the middle school, when we were thinking of expanding in that way, we brought in consultants, but we also began a study of adolescence in particular. I think coming to understand the nature of that period is really important. Some of it internally among the teachers and some of it in parent groups. This is a very accessible book that Betty Staley wrote, Between Form and Freedom, which formed a study group more than once among parents. An interesting thing happens at that age. You know, in 7th grade, I do these experiments in physics with 2 tuning forks. And these are large tuning forks on a wooden base, and you strike one, and then the other one is sitting a little bit away from it, and you stop it and listen. I wish I could do it for you, but you'll just have to imagine it. And the other one is sending the same note out because they're tuned together. And this is something called sympathetic vibration. And a kind of thing like this happens among children at this time. That something happens in school and they start vibrating, right? And then they come home and they start vibrating. And then the parents start vibrating. And then the teacher starts vibrating. Okay? And what do you really need as you move into that age? Well, in the thinking, you really need to bring them toward objectivity, which is not native to them at first, as the feeling life is so interwoven with the thinking. And in the feeling life, stability. They need people around them who are not going to just vibrate every time they start to vibrate, who are able to give them that sense it's all right, and that you have a certain cloak of equanimity around you and around them, different from what you would bring them in as little children, but that steadiness, that inner steadiness, and the teacher needs that very, very much. It's very easy to be thrown off into the wide swings, emotional swings, that children at this age will naturally go through. It's a time when a certain part of them is being born that is, well, you know how unready for survival alone a little baby is. It's similar with the birth of the soul life, the independent soul life. It's an infant, and it's kind of flailing around and trying to figure out where it's going to be. And one day it's in a state of fury. That common quote, this mother's in a mall with her daughter, and she's angry at her mother, and she's cursing her, and the mother says, "Why are you so angry?" And the girl says, "I'm not angry, I hate you." So it's that kind of, this little quote from Mark Twain. He just, when he was about this age, couldn't understand how stupid his father was. 5 or 6 years later, he's amazed how much his father had learned. So it's that kind of experience you have to really be prepared for. They look like adults, they think they're finished products, and they're moving in that direction, but without that steadiness in the feeling life, it's very hard for them to know where the boundaries are, where the walls are. Your range, the range of movement that you allow a child is going to expand at this age, but if it disappears, they're really at sea. They may want it, but if you watch them get that, you know that in the end it's not really what they needed. And in terms of the will, what they need is to be able to develop initiative, to be able to take a task and follow it through, and be able to sense that they can accomplish something. Because without will, when things get rough, what do you have? All you can do is suffer and then passively accept it. So objectivity in the thinking, equanimity and stability in the will, and in the feeling life, and initiative in the will. So maybe you've heard this business of head, heart, and hands, and thinking, feeling, and willing. They have their own themes and expectations at different points of life. I don't know if I answered your question, but don't just stumble into it would be my biggest advice. Think it through. Think about what that age is, what that age needs, and how individuals working with them can address it, and how an institution or an organization can as well. Any other questions? Yes?
What do the demographics look like socioeconomically, maybe ethnicity-wise? And it's been amazing to hear you speak, and my daughter is 5th grade, going to be 6th grade next year, and then moving on to that middle school. And I'm new to Waldorf education. It sounds like I wish we had a middle school, but I don't know if this is kind of maybe why you're here, and there might be that kind of movement. Maybe I just haven't been listening well enough to everybody to know what's kind of going on, so I'm sorry. But I guess what would be then, how, if there were financial constraints, you guys moving forward to a middle school, what were some of your guys' ideas, and how did you guys tackle those? Or do you guys just have a lot of wealthy people being able to pay and afford the schooling? Just curious on some of your ideas on how you guys tackle the budget.
I'm not sure where to start with all of that. In terms of wealthy people in the middle school versus any other part of the school, it's a challenge to pay for 2 school systems. There's no question. Your taxes are paying for one, and you're paying for another one here. We probably have more parents who are comfortable than we did in the early years, and we take a portion of that income to also offer a tuition assistance. We also depend on people who have the means to help in an annual fund and capital campaign. We had one some years ago which built a really nice gym and performing arts center. So there are certainly resources there. And Austin has been a city that has been just exploding in population and everybody who lives there is complaining about it because the traffic is horrible now, and the charm is some of it is wearing off. But there have been, in fact, the initiation of the school, the very beginnings of this particular school is just an interesting story, because the man who ran Sunbridge Institute, created the Waldorf Institute, which became Sunbridge, had taught in Los Angeles. One of his colleagues was a kindergarten teacher who couldn't continue teaching because she was ill. She moved to Lago Vista on one of the lakes near Austin. And later on, there was this young woman who had a baby, wanted to start a Waldorf school, and found her. She gave lectures, started the school. Her father had been instrumental in promoting some of the Impressionists painters years ago, and gave seed money at the beginning and helped open the doors. She died after 1 year of the school's operation, but did leave some money that helped some of these initial buildings to occur. So these are angels in the way that come and help on one level or another. Just like that story I told you where they worked to just strengthen what they were as a school, and then something came. You can't depend on that sort of thing, and every place is different and every circumstance is different. But I'm not even sure I remember what your question was, but it's a complicated thing. Every community is different. And just because we're large doesn't mean we don't have all sorts of issues to deal with as well. Yeah, and ups and downs in enrollment in certain areas, but generally, we were. I think probably the biggest challenge for a school is a young school is to attract qualified teachers, and that's an important thing to cultivate. And the more you have, the more you have to draw someone there, especially if they have children as well. So strengthening that within the current faculty, and then building out and building connections other places. Yes?
Do you guys do, I was looking at the website, it looks like you have weekend training at the school.
Yeah, it's not run by the school. It's run by a teacher who has got a training that is ongoing. You use the facilities of the school, and a lot of the teachers are teaching in it, myself and others. That's on a Saturday, on Saturdays through the school year.
So you could attend those trainings every weekend and then at some point be a certified Waldorf teacher?
Yes. Yeah. Along with practicums and classroom experience. And here there's a training in the summers, 3 weeks in the summer. A master teacher from New Zealand comes. I hear lots of good things about it. Lots of good things. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just out of curiosity, what percentage of the student body after 8th grade continues on into high school?
It's varied, and right now it's slipped a bit. In Waldorf schools throughout the country, the average is a little over 2/3. And that's partly because, if you understand this age as well, they're always looking for either a bigger social pool, some sport that that they may find somewhere else. One mother said her son wanted to go blatantly just because of girls. Go figure. So we have girls now. But it's at that age, sometimes there's a desire to look at other pastures and broader. And the big schools offer large social pools. It's one thing we can't do. A school may sound big to you compared to where we're at here now, but it's still not compared to 3,000-4,000 students in the local high school, of which there are several in Austin. So sometimes that's a draw. Sometimes they go and they're back within a year. That happens almost with every class, 1 or 2. will come back. One was in 7th grade in my daughter's class many years ago, and just, said she wanted to go elsewhere, left after 7th grade. Years later, got trained as a Waldorf teacher and came back to teach at the school. So life has all sorts of winding paths. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I ask you? Yeah, go ahead.
My impression has always been that a full Waldorf school is regarded to be one that goes up to 8th grade.
That's a common misconception in this country, because that's what there are more of those than there are with high schools.
That's what I was going to ask you, if that was really a living concept these days, or if there's more flexibility in it.
It really depends on circumstances. There are, I don't know how many high schools now, but there are quite a few in this country. They've been, do you know?
I think it's in the mid-30s.
That sounds probably right, yeah. And
But what about schools that go up through grades 5 or 6?
they all exist. There are some places where it's just kindergartens. And I was just at a school in Houston which goes up to just 2nd grade right now. It's 2 kindergartens in 2nd grade. They intend to move further on, and I gave a similar talk there, actually. But they're as diverse as the communities that have wanted them. And usually it starts with some parents who have heard about it and want to see something like that, and they can't move to San Francisco or Sacramento or Austin, but want to see something going. And often it starts with a play group and a kindergarten and grows from there. But there's no absolute. In Germany, where they get government subsidies, they'll start a school and it's got 2,000 or 3,000 students in the first year. I mean, it's a total, and there may be 3 of those in the city, like Frankfurt or the surrounding towns. It's amazing what difference it makes when there's some help to the funding. Yes.
So, you've talked a lot about some of the different practical things with the core faculty for helping to take a school into the next stage of evolution, perhaps in our case, middle school. I wonder if you could take some time to maybe talk more specifically about, from the parent community, those who are not of the core faculty, but those who maybe are holding an intention for very personal reasons of why they would like to see something like that manifest, of how they can bring their energies together in a way to help support that vision moving forward. Whether or not we're talking about the existing 1st grade, or we're talking about a 2nd, 3rd grade class, or even a 4th, 5th grade class.
Mm-hmm. Well, probably the most important thing is the word of mouth, which is always been our number one method of bringing in other people. Websites have gotten to be a big deal these days, but you may not know anybody and find it on a website. But just being able to spread some the enthusiasm that you may or may not have. Another aspect, I think, and I mentioned already, would be coming to do some study as well, to understand what child development is through a Waldorf perspective, an anthroposophical perspective, and the kind of study group that I mentioned. I think those kinds of gestures are starting points. And then it has to do with building what's here and strengthening it. What sort of volunteer work, is a festival, which can be a very public event as well, and have an interface with people who don't always come to the school. I go to our winter fair every year to see students who are in their 30s who are at the school, or others who have brought friends that have, that's their experience of the school. Things like this. And I think things evolve out of coming to know what a Waldorf school is, what child development in that light is, because if you don't, there are people who come here to kind of move away from something, and there are others who come here because they want this. That makes sense. It's common in, say, 6th grade for a child to not be having a good experience somewhere as that awakening is occurring, and to want to find something else. And that's fine, and we have students like that, and suddenly they are, just right in the center of the school. But it's also really valuable if you know that you're going towards something and not just away from something, going toward this creature called a Waldorf school and what makes it tick. So I think the initial gestures really start with coming to understand as much as possible. It's not that you have to subscribe to a doctrine or a secret handshake or anything else like that, but coming to know why you would want to be here as opposed to any other good school would be a starting point. And then just being ready, particularly in a pioneer situation or a young school situation, to roll up your sleeves and find out what's needed. I'm not sure if there's more that you have in mind, but that would be the starting point. And things evolve out of that. Yeah.
Just to continue that, because when you say I'm not sure if there's something else, it makes me wonder, in your experience, is there a critical mass of people involved in growing a school who no longer have that self-interest for their particular child, and yet have a love for what they have experienced either through earlier years for some of their children or through learning and participating in the festival life and study?
Yeah. It's not uncommon that people involved in the starting of a school, their children grow out of it before it's really grown as far as they would want to go. It's not an uncommon situation because it's a challenge to create a school like this in our society. It's not always conducive to it. And so in our school we have parents students of one woman who had 5 children go through the school, different ages, one set of twins, and had been out of the school for a couple of years, came back and volunteered to be on the board, and is now working on the board for 3 years. And there probably is one or two other. There've been a few parents like that who had an experience here and came back later, and they don't have the self-interest of their own children in the school right now, but they have a connection to it and an appreciation for it, that they are also contributing their energies to some extent. But it isn't, I had one of the early classes in the school, and the founder of the school had her son in my class, and we went up through 8th grade, and we were not, as I told you, not ready to move further beyond that, and so they moved on elsewhere to other schools. What you'll find is the further you go, the less attrition you have at certain earlier stages, but you have to be ready to really put something in place that is strong and ready to meet the children of that age. So where we're an 8th grade school, we had attrition starting in 6th grade because of certain connections to where the middle schools are in the public system. And when we had a high school, we didn't see that. It will happen more, maybe in high school. Any other questions? Comments? Tomatoes? Mm-hmm. Yes?
Do you have a recommended book just for the parent preparation for the teen?
There are a couple that I would think. One is Betty Staley's book, From Form to Freedom. I believe it's Between Form and Freedom. And there was another one by Herman Kopke, and I can't remember the name. Do you know what the name of it is? Yeah, it's blue. Get a blue book. He creates kind of hypothetical 6th grade classrooms. Yes, Encountering the Self by Herman Kopke. It's a great book.
But that's the 9-year.
Most of it is 6th grade, if I recall correctly. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's 6th grade. They may have also 9-year change working.
Really fixated on the.
Yeah, well, take another look. If it's not satisfying, she has my email address.
Well, I have a 9, almost 10-year-old, so I was reading that like 2 years ago, trying to compare myself to the 9-year change.
Yeah, well, it's kind of, one teacher says it's the sort of thing where We paused this program for a moment to bring you a message from Adolescence. It's coming. Here it is in the 9-year change, a little taste of it, and then the real thing comes later on. So there are a lot of similarities, but the intensity is different. But look at that book. I think that really does go into 6th grade. And if not, we'll find another one. The Struggle for Independence in the 12th year.
So different than the struggle for.
It's not Encountering the Self. Okay. Same author, I think.
Yeah.
On the Threshold of Adolescence, yeah. Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. It's real good. As is Betty Staley's, which I think goes also into high school, a little bit further. Anything else? Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Please